Alethea and I attend numerous agricultural conferences over the past years. And when we're at those conferences, we hear from any number of speakers about growing things, about agronomy. And each speaker generally is nationally, if not world known. So there are a lot of followers of that particular speaker, and the rooms are full of those folks. When I've been asked, I proclaim myself as a disciple of Elliot Coleman. I've watched his videos. I've read all of his books. I've read them. I've marked them up. I practice what he preaches. I was going to bring my stack of books today to demonstrate, but I didn't want to carry them, so I left them at home. I also profess to be a disciple of Neil Kinsey. And Neil Kinsey professes himself to be a disciple of Dr. William Albrecht. Dr. Albrecht, years and years and years ago, got himself fired from the University of Missouri because they didn't like what he was teaching about soils and how that you didn't need all these chemicals to have good crops from soils. Dr. Albrecht perfected a way of testing soil that would allow him to determine exactly what nutrients the soil needed and how to bring those into balance. And so Neil was his last student and last one to be certified by him. And I have followed Neil for many years. I've flown to South Dakota twice for 3-day conferences to listen to Neil speak all day for 3 days. I send him my soil for soil test. I follow his instructions when it comes to fertilizing on the farm. But you know, on another level, on a spiritual level, most of us, if not all of us in this room, consider ourselves to also be disciples. That's why we're here today. We discussed last time the idea of spiritual discipleship, which for most of us has its genesis in the Gospels, the 12 disciples and Jesus Christ, their rabbi. We also think of ourselves as disciples of Jesus. First sermon, I went back and talked about what it was like to be a disciple at the time of Christ, what a rabbi's job was, and the relationship between the rabbi and his disciples. If you were a disciple, you were called to by a few prominent rabbis, but more often you applied to, made application to the rabbi you wanted to study under. And if accepted, you were asked to follow or walk after your rabbi. You willingly submitted to his authority over all aspects of your life. You placed your allegiance to him, even above your very own family. You made it your life goal to memorize his words, his teachings, his interpretation of Scripture. You made it your desire to live your life exactly the same way that he lived his. There were stories of disciples who would sneak into the rabbi's home to see exactly how he slept and how he did everything, so they could go and they would do exactly what he did. You know, that's the way it was then. And I believe the way it is today to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. We do those same things. Those are our same goals. But my next question is rather pointed. Whose disciple are you really? I'll ask myself the same question. Whose disciple am I really? 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 10. As we read these verses, think about what must the atmosphere have been like in Corinth when Paul wrote these words? What was the environment like if you gathered on a Sabbath wherever they might have been gathering, whether the synagogue or somewhere else. Why did Paul have to go here? Verse 10, he says, "Now I beseech you, brethren, through the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing, that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfected together in the same mind, in the same judgment. For it's been signified unto me concerning you, my brethren, by them that are of the household of Chloe, that there are contentions among you." Now, this is what I mean, that each one of you says, "I'm a disciple of Paul," or "I'm a disciple of Apollos," "I'm a disciple of Cephas," or "I'm a disciple of Christ." Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, lest any man should say that you were baptized into my name, that you were my disciple. And oh yeah, I forgot, I did baptize also the household of Stephanas. But besides them, I know not whether I baptized any other. For Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not in the wisdom of my words, lest the cross of Christ should be made void. Years ago, not many years after I graduated from Ambassador College, Worldwide went through its first major split. It's when Garner Ted and Mr. Ron Dart left the church, and they started another organization that we know as Church of God International. In those days, when I'd get a phone call from a friend, one of the first questions that we ask one another is, or was, where are you going to church now? In other words, are you still at Worldwide, or have you gone to Garner Ted? If we both were still at Worldwide, which I still was, and we would talk about the possibility of going somewhere else, I would ask a simple question. What is Mr. Blackwell doing? Because wherever Mr. Blackwell goes, that's where I'm going to go. Whose disciple was I really? You know, in my youth, as growing up in the church, Mr. Blackwell was a minister of mythical proportions, a biblical scholar, a man of great spiritual strength. He had visited in our home, spent the night in our home, was friends with my mom and dad. I believed that if there was any trouble, Mr. Blackwell would know the right way to go. It's interesting how that many years later, back in the 90s, when Worldwide was going through its next major division, and I was attending church in Lafayette, Louisiana, Mr. Blackwell came to town. Our pastor was John O'Gwen, and he wasn't going with the changes. And Mr. Blackwell came to town to preach to us, to try to convince us that we should accept all the new changes. Who was I going to follow now? In more recent times, when COG was split, I had a good friend back in another United Church. And we were talking about where we were going to go. And he said, I'm going wherever Mr. Winter's going. Because Mr. Winter was his pastor, his spiritual giant, the one he followed. And I knew this man well. And I'm sure if I'd have asked him who he was a disciple of, he would have told me he was a disciple of Jesus Christ. Was he really? And looking back on it, there were two positive things that came out of the split in Worldwide back in the 70s, whenever it was. 90s, I guess. The first one I recognized early on, and that was that I didn't need the church to be my high priest. I already had a high priest, and I didn't need the church to get to God. I had a high priest to go through. And I'd ignored him for a long, long time. The second impact didn't come till much later. But as time went on, as I had to learn to stand on my own 2 feet for what I believed, and I really believed that God had me in Lafayette, Louisiana, 800, 900 miles away from mom and dad. So I couldn't lean on my dad. And back in those days, Andy Prettyman in some areas is kind of like saying Dean Blackwell. So I didn't have him to lean on. I had to lean on myself. And I became, in those years, a disciple of Jesus Christ. My beliefs became my beliefs. And I developed them because of my study and my development of a relationship with him. Over the years, my spiritual life has been impacted by a lot of church splits, and worldwide and united several times, even in the home fellowships we've been a part of. In looking back over them, every situation can be described or explained when you explore these two thoughts or ideas. The first, I began with last time. It came from Mr. McNeely at the conference in Cincinnati. A true disciple has never led a group out of the church or out of the group they're in into a new following. The second is closely related to it. A disciple never forgets who his rabbi is, and it's not him, not himself. When you put those two things together, and you understand that for us, we will forever be a disciple. And a disciple never tries to become the rabbi that they're following. Stay with me here. I'm going to try to make all this clearer as we go along. Matthew 18, or 28, verse 16. Very familiar scriptures to us, but we've used them and read them as though they only belong to or for a certain select few of people, rather than the entire body of the church. But as I hope to show, I believe we see both the past and the future growth. The path of future growth and the source of past divisions, all in these two sets of scriptures. Matthew 28, 16. But the 11 disciples went into Galilee, into the mountain where Jesus had appointed them. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came to them and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given unto me in heaven and on earth. Go you, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them into the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things whatever I have commanded you to do. And lo, I am with you always, even until the end of the world. In the first century AD, the goal of every disciple was to one day become a rabbi and have disciples of his own. Sometimes it happened when the rabbi thought that, you've learned enough, you know enough, you're well-trained enough, it's time to go. Most of the time it happened when the rabbi died, and his disciples then took up his mantle and went out. So it's natural that here in Matthew 28, in his last words on earth, Christ also told his disciples, by extension, you and I, to go out and make disciples. But we don't read Matthew 28 in isolation. Let's go to Matthew 23, verse 1. And as we read this, think about any church split you've ever been a part of, and especially those leading the split. Matthew 23, verse 1. Then spoke Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, and all therefore whatsoever they bid you, observe. that observe and do. Now here Jesus was affirming the authority of the Jewish spiritual leadership as established at that time. But notice he's about to qualify what he's saying. Also notice he is still on the earth. He's not died, been resurrected, or become our high priest. So he's still talking to people who are alive as he is. But do not you after their works, for they say and do not. They're hypocrites, and they make themselves above the law. For they bind heavy burdens that are grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders. Think about last time in the yoke we talked about and what the yoke means. But they themselves will not move with one of their fingers. All of their works they do to be seen of men. They make broad phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the utmost rooms at the feast and the chief seats in the synagogues, and the greetings in the markets, and to be called of men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But be not you called Rabbi, for one is your master, even Christ, and all are your brothers and sisters. And call no man your spiritual father upon the earth, for one is your Father, which is in heaven. Neither be you called masters, guides, or master teachers, for one is your master, even Christ. But he that is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased. For he that shall humble himself shall be exalted. Again, the disciple of Jesus' day looked forward to and spent every day training so he could one day become a rabbi when he would be the master teacher. Our instructions are quite different. We are currently disciples of Jesus Christ. We've been told that we are to make disciples, but we aren't making disciples for ourselves. Our rabbi is still alive. We're to be making disciples for Jesus Christ. We can expand those ideas to organizations. No church organization, no church leader in that organization, no pastor of a local church, no other person that considers themselves a spiritual leader is to claim the title of or act like they see themselves as rabbi or father or master. No one has authority to make disciples to themselves. But yet we're all given the responsibility of making disciples for Jesus Christ. And herein lies the problem. Consider these rhetorical questions. I'm not going to answer these today, they're for you to think about. How do we, at any level, work to nurture, support, develop, encourage, make disciples without letting ourselves get carried away and thinking of ourselves as a rabbi? And just as importantly, how do we as disciples, being nurtured and fed and taught, encouraged and supported, developed by others, keep from allowing them to become our rabbi, even if it's only in our own mind? And then thirdly, how do we react when our own personal study and efforts to be good disciples of Jesus Christ lead us to understandings that conflict with our teachers and our fellow disciples? In other words, what does it look like? How should it look when disciples interact with each other within the congregation, especially when they disagree? And what do you do when a disciple begins to act too much like a rabbi? Sitting in that conference that day, hearing Mr. McNeely make that statement, the light bulb came on in my brain. Most of us have been in a church organization, a congregation, or a fellowship where doctrinal issues have come up. Different people having different ideas about one biblical topic or another. And sometimes it's gotten ugly. People leaving, church splits, and so on. In Bowling Green, our home church, United in Bowling Green, there are different ideas within the congregation about when to observe Passover. There are different ideas about what's an appropriate name for God, what's an appropriate name for Jesus. There are different ideas about when the first resurrection will be. Some believe it's Pentecost, others believe it's trumpets. There are different ideas about whether it's a sin to go out and eat on the Sabbath. There are different ideas about, does the Azazel goat represent one Christ and one Satan, or do they both represent Jesus Christ? And that's only a beginning of differences of opinion that are among the 30 people or so who attend together in peace in Bowling Green. Our doctrinal differences have never created a problem within our congregation. Our congregation has always been known as being a hodgepodge of people from different church backgrounds, whether it's CGI or little home fellowships or whatever. And so it's been that way for a lot of years. Again, I go back to Mr. McNeely's statement. A true disciple never tries to start their own following, never tries to cause a split. In Bowling Green, I can honestly say, we are all striving to be disciples first. None of us is seeking a following, and none of us wants to be a rabbi. And I really believe if anybody's moved in that direction, several of us would pull them aside and say, wait a minute, that's not how we do things here. We're happy to have a discussion, but we're not looking for people to take leadership roles in that way. So I guess the point of what I'm saying to this point is if we could all maintain that understanding that we will always be disciples, we're never to become a rabbi. We already have a rabbi that we're following. That would solve so many problems that we have had over the years, not just in our church, but in churches everywhere, where people dividing over doctrine. In Romans 8:28, we're told that we've been called for a purpose. I really deeply believe that that purpose is not just an eternal purpose, that we're called for a purpose today. Comment was made earlier about the article that, I know his name as well as my own. The dad was talking about in the announcements. Anyway, why me, Lord? I have been really, and I may have mentioned it here, forgive me if I have, but it's worth saying it again. I've really been pounding home at home. Mark Welch, thank you. And so I've not read his article. I don't know what he said, but I really believe this is true. God called you and I, knowing full well what was going to happen in this country, in this world, while we were alive. And so he didn't call us this time by accident. He didn't call us just at random. And he must have known when he did that whatever we've got to do, whatever we have to go through, that we could handle it. Or he wouldn't have called us and he wouldn't have put us here. And so it's hard sometimes, but I try to remember that and say, God, give me the courage to keep going and not to let it all get me too far down. Well, anyway, back to the idea of making disciples. Matthew 4, verse 18. and having a discussion with a lot of people here and other places. Is our role at this time in history to be disinterested bystanders? Or should we be thinking any differently than we have in the past in light of what's going on in the world? As we saw our earlier discussion on disciples, when a young man sought out a rabbi to be his disciples, it was because, again, he had aspirations of being a disciple one day. When Jesus called to Simon Peter and his brother Andrew to leave their work and become his disciple, what did he promise them that they would become one day? Matthew 4:18. And Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee and saw two brethren, Simon called Peter and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And he said unto them, follow me, come and be my disciples, and I will make you fishers of men. I'll teach you to also go and make disciples. And straightway they left their nets and followed him. Little could they have imagined what they were getting themselves into. The next 3.5 years, motivations changed. Their view of the future changed. Their expectation for their own lives changed. They also learned who this rabbi really was and what he'd really come to the earth to do and what his purpose for them and their lives was. Go back to Matthew 28:18 again, just for a minute. So in the end, keeping I will make you fishers of men in mind, Jesus brings it all around full circle to the day that he carried them away from their nets. And here we are just before he leaves them for the last time. And he's given them his final instructions before he goes to be with his Father. And Jesus says to them, all authority has been given me in heaven and on earth. Go you therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things, whatever I commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. I promised to make you fishers of men. The last time you saw me, you were in your boat. I gave you full net of fish. I'm with you now. I will be with you always. Go and fish, and I will fill your nets. Most of us have been taught most of our spiritual lives what we've been called to be spiritual members of God's family, and thus we are. We've been called to be kings and priests in that kingdom. But what about now? Here's another little thought to let percolate in your mind. The odds of winning the lottery in Kentucky are somewhere around 1 in 300 million. Now, based upon the work I've done in math, the population of the United States, the odds of you being called by God and being here in this room today is something around 1 in 329,500,000. You have to let that sink in for a little bit. For our calling to be so rare, shouldn't we think that God must have some important purpose for us right here and now in this life, as well as in the next? Matthew 19, verse 27. Jesus was even more specific with the 12. He told us we'll be kings and priests. With the 12, he told them a whole lot more. And the realization fell upon the disciples of just what they were giving up to follow Jesus. They wanted to know, what am I going to get out of this? Goes back to the sermonette. I'll give, but what do I get back? Matthew 19:27. Then Peter said unto him, behold, we have forsaken all and followed you. What shall we have therefore? And Jesus said unto them, verily I say unto you, that you which have followed me in this regeneration, when the Son of Man shall sit on the throne of his glory, you also shall sit upon the 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Verse 29. And everyone else that has forsaken houses, or brothers, or sisters, or fathers, or mothers, or wives, or children, or lands, for my name's sake, shall receive 100-fold, and shall inherit everlasting life. I really believe we've been called to make disciples, and like the disciples, our reward is not going to be to sit as kings of the 12 tribes of Israel, but great rewards. Just jot down Hebrews 5, verses 11 and 12, referred to later. I think those two verses are often skipped over. Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians 2, verse 19. I don't believe the work of making disciples was meant to be a solitary job. We know that God enjoys the idea of family. He cherishes the ideas of peace, working together in fellowship. In Ephesians 2, verse 19, Paul is speaking, and he says, now therefore you are no more strangers and foreigners, speaking to the Gentiles at Ephesus, but you are fellow citizens and saints of the household of God. And you are built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom all the building fitly framed together grows unto a holy temple in the Lord, in which you are also included or being built together for a habitation of God through the Spirit. Verse 21, fitly framed together. We must be as disciples of Jesus Christ. We're not a hodgepodge of misfit pieces that somebody's trying to force together randomly into one unit. We are fitly framed together. 1 Corinthians 12, verse 12. In Ephesians, Paul talks of being fitly framed together in a temple. Here we talk about a body. 1 Corinthians 12, verse 12. For as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of that one body being many are one body, so also is Christ. The idea of a body is kind of interesting. Paul doesn't describe its scope, its size, who he intends to include in his thoughts here about all being a part of one body. It's a metaphor that's been used and even misused in different ways over the years, sometimes to include people, sometimes to exclude. You've heard it talked about to define a certain church organization, maybe to define all the people that are being called by God, wherever they may be. But for our conversation today, most pertinent to us is this one body you see right here. You are one body. Alethea and I are visitors, but you are one body. All the people that sit in these chairs from week to week are one body. As we read through this, think of yourselves as the one body he's talking about. For by one Spirit, Are we all baptized into one body? Whether we be Jews or Gentiles, whether we be bond or free, we've been made all made to drink into one spirit. For the body is not one member, but many. If the foot shall say, because I am not the hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? And if the ear shall say, because I'm not an eye, I'm not of the body, isn't it still part of the body? If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole were hearing, where would the smelling be? But now has God set the members, every one of them, in the body as it has pleased him. How did you come to be here today? You individually, each one of you. Today here in this congregation at this time. I know everybody in the room has a different story about how God called them, how God got your attention and drew you to him. But there are other Sabbath-keeping organizations all across the state of Kentucky. There are organized churches. There are home fellowships that keep the Sabbath and the holy days and believe most of the same things you do. But you're here. Why? Because of chance or an accident? Or did God place you in this room with this group of people? Placed in the body as it pleases him. Do we believe it's our own choice? Back in our home fellowship days, we would sometimes visit a United where we attended prior to that. A good friend of ours would ask and say to me, all these people that you are going to church with, why don't they just come over to United? And I'd look at him and I'd say, well, I guess because God hasn't placed them there. And he placed them where he did place them. I look at the road Alethea and I have traveled over the last 20 plus years. And unless or until God tells me different, I believe that everywhere we have been, including being right back in Bowling Green, and there's a very clear story I can tell you of why we're there and how we got there. And it wasn't my doing. God placed us in every one of those locations, I believe, with all my heart, and I've got the stories to tell. To me, this verse says that God placed you in the group, in the local body where you fit the best. And I'll let you percolate that in your brain and think about what that means. Because if it's true, how does that impact your life? How does that impact your connection to one another? How does that impact the way you think about your spiritual life and your relationships? What's the part he expects you to play as a part of this body? There's a young man giving a sermon in Bowling Green today for the first time. He has matured more in the last year than I've seen out of somebody in a long time. But right after COVID, we started back up from COVID, started going back to church again. Kevin, our pastor, had to be gone for most of 2 months. And Jay and I were the only 2 men at church. I teased with Kevin. I said, you were going to come back and I was going to have women praying in church because we didn't have anybody to pray. There was male. So anyway, Jay never led songs. And when he first got up there, all he could do was, let's turn to this page, and he's standing there and sing. He has a great voice. He can play guitar like nobody, but he had no ability to lead songs, couldn't read music. Well, over the months, he's learned to lead songs. He's gone on YouTube and found videos and learned to lead songs and had been given sermonettes and so on. And now today, we had a spot. I had no one to speak today. I do the speaking schedule. So Jay's given a sermon. We've got other people that, They just didn't want to give opening prayer or closing prayer for that matter. But they would pray in a private setting, do a great job. Finally got Danny to go ahead and give opening prayer. Everybody has got a job to do in the group, outside, wherever. How does it change our attitudes if we think in terms of God placed us right where we are? Verse 19. And if they were all one member, if we were all arms or all were feet or all were hands, then where would the body be? But now are we many members, many different parts, so that we together make one body. And the eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. I know that things come up. We're not in control of all our circumstances. We have COVID. But how does the church function when we're not all here on the Sabbath? How would your body function if every 2 or 3 days your arm was missing for a day or two, and you found it and put it back on? That's kind of the body. If we're not all here, if we're not all active, if we're not all participating. But now are we many members, many different body parts, but together we make one body. The eye cannot say unto the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. No, much more these members of the body which seem to be more feeble are necessary. And those members of the body which we think to be less honorable, upon these we need to bestow more abundant honor. And our uncomely parts have more abundant comeliness, for our comely parts have no need. But God, but has tempered. But God has tempered. The word tempered there means commingled, combined, assembled the body together. God's done it. He's placed us here. But God has tempered the body together, having given more abundant honor to that part which has lacked, that there should be no schism in the body, but that the members should have the same care one for the other. The split or division here that Paul's talking about is related to the way that we esteem one another, playing favorites, forming cliques, that sort of thing. The same is true for divisions caused by differences of understanding or belief spiritually. We can't allow either one of those to divide us. Verse 26, whether one member suffers, all the members suffer with it, or one member be honored, all the members rejoice with it. Now you are the body of Christ, and members in particular. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Lastly, I want to look at this one idea of us all being members of one body of disciples. It's only 8 weeks till Passover. And I think it's interesting to hear the importance that Paul places on this idea of one body in reference to our keeping Passover. Y'all may have noticed this a long time ago, but it just really, especially last year when we had Passover in homes and 2 or 3 or 4 of us, this really struck me. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 16. The cup of blessing, in other words, the wine which we bless, is it not the communion? In other words, the partnership we have in the shed blood of Christ. And the bread which we break, is it not the communion, or again, the partnership we have in the broken body of Jesus Christ? For we being many, we just read about being many in parts of the same body. For we being many are one bread, one body, for we are all partakers of that one bread. Can we come together and take the Passover if we are not one unified body. And if I'm reading Paul correctly, when we share the Passover, it's more than just a connection between us and Jesus Christ and us and God. It is a connection and a bond that we share with everyone else who's coming together on that same evening, taking of that same broken bread. It bonds us all together as disciples. It's kind of like I described a marriage. It's really a threesome because it's husband, it's wife, and it's God. And here, it's everyone taking of that bread and Jesus Christ and his Father. Each one of us sees ourselves as a disciple of Jesus Christ. It's incumbent upon each one of us to test our profession, to make sure that Jesus is really our rabbi. As a disciple, I believe we're called to make disciples. And I am, like you, struggling with how I go about doing that. But I think it's a struggle worth having if I'm going to fulfill my purpose in this present life. In the process of calling us to be his disciples, I believe God has intentionally placed us in a group of other disciples where we are meant to make a contribution and work together in completing the whole. We are meant to work together, fellowship together, worship together, support each other, pray for each other, make disciples together. We are a part of the body that God has prepared. We're not here by accident.